Hey guys, tonight we journey into a world you think you know, but trust me, you don't. It's a world of wide open plains, rattling spurs, and the endless creak of saddle leather beneath star-pinned skies. But beneath the romantic haze of westerns and worn-out cowboy ballads lies a reality far colder, far harsher, and far more uncomfortable than Hollywood ever dared show. Tonight, we aren't galloping into town with 6 shooters blazing. We're just trying to survive the night. Literally. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe. But only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And let me know in the comments what time it is where you're tuning in from. It's always fascinating to see how far and wide we drift together. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft hum in the background, and let's slip together into tonight's story. Tonight's journey: how cowboys survived a freezing night in the wild. Forget everything you've seen in the movies, the saloons, the showdowns, the perfectly timed harmonica solos. Tonight isn't about adventure. It's about survival. It's about you, alone on the range, wrapped in a threadbare blanket, your horse hobbled nearby, and the icy breath of winter slithering across the high plains like a ghost in the dark. Because when the sun dropped behind the jagged mountains and the wind came screaming down from the north, the cowboys didn't ride into the sunset. They hunkered down, shivering, praying, and swearing at their luck. And tonight, so do you. You're not in a warm bunkhouse. You're not even near one. You're somewhere out there in the bitter wild, miles from the nearest fence post, knee-deep in snow, with nothing but a canvas bedroll, a saddlebag full of beans, and the fire you're trying desperately to keep alive with wet twigs and dry curses. So, let's slow everything down. Let's peel back the layers of myth and settle into the real story. One of frostbitten fingers, smoking coffee pots, and boots that turn to stone by dawn. Over the next 2 hours, we're going to walk quietly, slowly, through what it really meant to be a cowboy spending the night out under the stars, when those stars were frozen. We'll feel the cold in your bones. We'll talk about how you made camp, how you kept your horse alive, how you didn't freeze to death when the wind came howling, and your boots were already soaked from the river crossing 10 miles back. We'll hear the eerie groans of cattle clustered for warmth, the pop of the fire, and maybe, just maybe, the long, lonesome call of a coyote who doesn't seem half as cold as you are. This is no hero's tale. It's a bedtime story for the weary, the curious, and the insomniacs who like their history a little gritty, a little miserable, and a whole lot honest. So pull your blanket close. Shift a little deeper into the pillow. Let the wind rustle just outside your mind. You're about to find out what it really meant to survive a freezing night on the wild frontier. And don't worry. By the time this tale ends, you'll be glad you're not out there with frost on your beard and beans frozen in the pot. Let's begin. You wake up to the sound of nothing. Not silence exactly. There's the wind, thin, distant, curling like a whisper through frozen grass and dead brush. There's your horse somewhere off to the left, snorting a cloud of steam into the air. There's the occasional creak of leather, the shuffle of something small and clawed moving through the snow. But no voices, no trains, no engines, no civilization. Your eyes open, and the world is steel gray. You're on the high plains, or maybe tucked up against the foothills of the Rockies. It's hard to say where exactly. Cowboys didn't have GPS. They had instincts, hooves, and the vague memory of a trail last ridden weeks ago. But you know this much. It's freezing. Not cold. Not chilly. Freezing. Your face feels tight, stiff with night frost. The corner of your mustache, if you've got one, is iced over, and you feel it break when you flex your upper lip. There's a thin film of rime along the edge of your blanket. Your breath is visible, slow and ghostly. Each exhale curls up and then vanishes, like the warmth trying to escape from your body and deciding halfway through, never mind, too cold out here. You're not in a bed. You're in a bedroll, and calling it that is generous. It's a canvas sack with a bit of wool blanket inside, stiff from last night's moisture. You're curled up like a question mark, fully dressed, coat on, hat still shoved down over your ears, boots laced but loose because frozen boots are nearly impossible to get back on if they tighten overnight. The ground underneath you is frozen. Every part of your body that touches the earth feels like it's resting against stone, hard, unrelenting, and getting colder by the minute. You shift, but it doesn't help. Your hip bone aches. Your knees creak. Your spine feels like it aged 40 years overnight. Your saddle is your pillow. It smells like horse sweat, old dust, and dried leather. Not comforting, but familiar. You probably tucked it under your head out of habit, and to keep it from freezing solid if it got left out too long. You try to stretch. Big mistake. Your shoulders pop. One of your feet is half numb. The blanket wrapped around your legs crackles with frost. You move your arms quickly under your coat to rub life back into your fingers. You can't afford to lose feeling. Cowboys didn't retire. They just got slower until they couldn't rope anymore. Frostbite meant the end of work. And for a cowboy, that meant the end of eating. You sit up. The fire's out. It died sometime in the night. A smoldering heap of wet coals now barely alive. You didn't have the energy to keep it going after midnight, and your supply of dry twigs was gone anyway. The few logs you had were buried under snow or burned fast. You should have banked it better. Too late now. You squint at the horizon. Still no sun. Just the faintest hint of light behind a curtain of icy clouds. The kind of morning where the sky glows but never really warms. The wind kicks up again, dry and bitter, and you instinctively hunch your shoulders to block it, even though it's already crept under your coat and found its favorite spot along your ribs. You look at your fingers. They're cracked. Dirt under the nails. A bit of ash, maybe a splinter from the firewood. You slept in your gloves, but only half on, your fingertips poking out for dexterity. Mistake number 2. You flex them. They hurt. That's good. Pain means they're still yours. Your horse stomps nearby, impatient. He wants oats. You don't have oats. He wants warmth. You don't have that either. You hobble over to check his rope, tied low to a bush, and give him a pat on the neck. His body radiates heat, jealous heat, and steam curls from his nostrils like a kettle left on the stove. You murmur something to him. Doesn't matter what. Just noise. So he knows you're still human. You try to stand fully upright and stretch again. Mistake number 3. Your back gives you a warning crack. Your knees remind you that sleeping on frozen dirt in the same position for 8 hours is not something the human body is built to do. You groan loudly because no one's around to hear it. The world is all grays and browns, frosted tufts of grass poking up through a layer of half-melted snow. A few distant black trees standing like forgotten skeletons on the ridge. Your breath is the only thing moving fast. Everything else is still, locked in the slow-motion sleep of winter. You shuffle back to your gear. Your canteen's stiff, not frozen, but close. You tip it carefully, and the water moves like syrup. You take a sip. It tastes like metal and cold and leftover ashes, but it's wet, and that's all you care about. Breakfast? Not yet. That's for later. First, you need to move. Get the blood flowing. Because out here, in this kind of cold, if you sit too long, you stop. You brush snow off your coat, smack your gloves together, shake the last frost from your hat. You check your boots, stiff but wearable. They'll thaw once you start walking, hopefully. A cowboy's boots were never meant for luxury. They weren't insulated. They weren't waterproof. They were just leather. And leather cracks in the cold like anything else. You wiggle your toes to test for sensation. Not great, but not gone. You bend down, roll up the bedroll, clumsy fingers fighting frozen canvas, and lash it tight with a strap. You tie it back to your saddle, hoping it doesn't collect more frost before night falls again. And you realize, as you look around at the vast emptiness, that you're utterly alone. The herd, if there was one, is gone or grazing somewhere a mile down the slope. Maybe your partner, if you even had one, took first watch and fell asleep. Or maybe he rode on. Or maybe you dreamed him. Out here, dreams and memory blur, especially when your brain's half frozen. You take a breath and feel it cut down your throat like a knife. This is the morning. No coffee yet. No fire. No warmth. Just cold air, frozen dirt, and the realization that you made it through the night. That's victory. Because that's what a cowboy's morning really was. A slow, painful awakening to another day of survival. No fanfare. No glory. Just the dull throb of cold bones, the sharp bite of winter wind, and the long, long day ahead. And tonight, you get to do it all over again. You don't eat breakfast because you're hungry. You eat breakfast because if you don't, the day will eat you. There's no breakfast bell, no table, no kitchen. Just your saddlebags, the cold ground, and the fire that isn't even a fire anymore. It's a black crust of ash and a few cold stones that look like they've given up. You crouch next to what used to be warmth and nudge the coals with a stick. Nothing. Not even a whisper of heat. So you do what cowboys did every freezing morning in the wild. You start over. You dig out your flint and steel. Your fingers don't want to cooperate. They're stiff, shaking, more bark than skin. You curse under your breath, quietly and without flair. You've said these same curses 1,000 times. They don't help, but they're tradition. Strike. Spark. Again. Again. A puff of smoke. There. Finally. You cradle the ember like a baby bird and feed it whatever scraps of kindling you remembered to stash away in your bedroll. Bits of grass, some bark, a page from a worn-out almanac. Eventually the fire catches, weak and apologetic. You blow on it until your cheeks hurt. It flutters. You add a stick, then another. And at last, the flame stands on its own. Now you can cook, not that there's much to cook. You rummage through your saddlebag. Tin cup, iron skillet, coffee beans. Beans, and more beans. And something that once was a biscuit, but now looks and feels like a petrified horseshoe. You drop the beans into the skillet. They clatter like coins. Then you pour in some water, stale, coppery, barely enough to cover the bottom. You set the skillet on the edge of the fire and let it sputter to life. The smell? Burnt, vaguely metallic, slightly sour, but it's warm, and that's the main thing. Cowboy food wasn't made to taste good. It was made to not kill you. Most of the time. If you're lucky, and you remembered, you might have some salt pork wrapped in paper and stuffed deep in your gear. Not fresh. Nothing's fresh. But a couple slices, fried hard, will at least smell like civilization. You drop a piece into the pan. It hisses like it's mad at you. Fat pops. You flinch. One drop of hot grease on a cold finger is enough to make you see stars. Still, you wait. Because this bubbling mess of beans and salt and smoke, is the highlight of your culinary day. There's no plate. You eat straight from the skillet with a tarnished spoon, or maybe a knife. Cowboys didn't pack cutlery sets. They ate with whatever wasn't nailed down. The food is hot and immediate. The beans stick to your teeth. The salt pork crunches on the edges and squishes in the middle like a bad decision. You chew fast, not because it tastes good, but because it gets cold fast. Everything does. Next comes the coffee. You don't grind the beans. You don't measure them. You just drop them in, whole, and boil the life out of them until the water turns black. This is cowboy coffee. It's more like a warning than a beverage. The grounds float. They cling to your lips. They sink into the cracks in your cup. But the first sip, scalding and bitter, feels like a rebirth. For a moment, you forget you're freezing. Then the wind reminds you. That's breakfast. 2 bites of something chewy, 2 gulps of something hot, and you're done. Now it's time to get clean. Well, cowboy clean. There's no basin, no soap, no towel, no hot water. Just the leftover coffee and whatever snow hasn't turned to slush under the fire pit. You cup your hands in the snow, scoop some up, and slap it against your face. It stings. Your cheeks flush. Your nose runs instantly. But the cold clears your head and wakes up whatever part of your brain the coffee didn't reach. You wipe your face with your sleeve. It's not dry. It's not clean. But it's all you've got. Teeth? That's a luxury. Some cowboys chewed spruce twigs to clean their teeth. Others didn't bother. Toothbrushes existed, sure, but they weren't making the trip out west. If you were lucky, you had a bit of cloth you rubbed on your molars to scrape off the grit. If you were really lucky, you didn't lose any teeth to rot. Yet. You feel around with your tongue. Everything's still there. That's good enough. You check your armpits, not out of vanity, just curiosity. Your shirt hasn't been washed in weeks, maybe months. It smells like smoke, leather, and whatever your body has been doing while riding for 10 hours a day through sun, wind, and cold. And bathing? Huh. Bathing is for towns, and you're not in one. On the trail, a bath meant stripping down beside a stream and throwing handfuls of near-freezing water over yourself while trying not to die of shock. You'd scrub yourself with sand or pine needles, maybe a rag. Then you'd jump around like an idiot to dry off before your skin froze to your ribs. You did it maybe once a week, maybe less. Cowboys had a different definition of hygiene. If no one could smell you over the campfire, you were clean enough. You lift your shirt. There's a patch of dried blood from yesterday's saddle sore, a crust of sweat on your chest, dust under your collar. You shrug. Nothing unusual. You relieve yourself off behind a mesquite bush. Privacy is relative. So is dignity. There's no toilet paper. You use what you have. Dry grass, a page from that same almanac, or just grit your teeth and hope for the best. You've had worse mornings. You'll have worse again. Afterward, you rinse your hands with cold water from your canteen. Not enough to feel clean, just enough to say you tried. No soap, no mirror, no deodorant. And still, you've done more than most cowboys would bother with. You're clean, for now. You stomp your boots into the snow to knock loose the mud from yesterday. One of them makes a sound that shouldn't happen. The sole is coming loose again. You'll fix it later. Maybe. For now, you saddle up. You stow the skillet, pack away your cup, douse the fire, and cinch your gear. Everything smells like smoke, bacon, and something that used to be alive. You slap your hat onto your head. It's stiff with cold. You shift in your coat. It creaks like a door hinge. And with that, your morning's done. You're fed. You're not clean, but you're cleaner than you were. Your hands are warm. Your horse is restless. And the trail, as always, waits. Clothing wasn't about fashion out here. It was about survival. You didn't dress to impress. You dressed to not freeze, not blister, not bleed. Cowboy clothing was a uniform made of equal parts discomfort, necessity, and dirt. And every layer had a reason. Let's start with the closest thing to your skin. Underwear? If you had any, it was long johns, one piece buttoned up wool or cotton, and almost never washed. They were itchy, always itchy. The kind of itch that got in under your skin. Like you were hosting a colony of fleas who paid rent in misery. You wore them until they were stiff with sweat. Then you wore them a little longer. Changing meant stripping down in the cold. And no cowboy with a lick of sense wanted to be naked on the open prairie in winter. Above that, your shirt, flannel, wool, or cotton. Stiff at the collar, patched at the elbows. The same shirt you worked in, slept in, fought in. A cowboy might own 2 shirts, one for wearing, one for stuffing in a saddlebag and pretending was cleaner than it actually was. You didn't tuck it in neatly. You didn't iron it. You buttoned it halfway and left it that way for a week. And if it rained, it stuck to you like regret. Over that, your vest. The unsung hero. It had pockets. Glorious, precious pockets. For your watch, your knife, maybe a flask. Maybe a letter you hadn't sent in 2 years. It didn't keep you warm, not really. But it made you feel like you were trying. And then came the coat. The duster. Long canvas or oilskin. Designed to block wind, dust, rain, and everything else the West liked to throw at you. It was heavy. When it got wet, it doubled in weight and smelled like mildew and horse sweat. The tails flapped behind you like a flag, announcing you were cold, wet, and extremely tired. You wrapped it around you at night, slept on it, bled on it, sometimes used it as a saddle blanket when you were desperate. If you were lucky, the inside had a quilted lining. If you were rich, maybe shearling. But most didn't have that luxury. You just layered wool on top of wool and hoped your body heat didn't abandon ship by sundown. Your pants, called trousers or sometimes breeches, were denim, canvas, or thick wool. Stiff, hot in the summer, cold in the winter, and always torn in the worst places. You didn't own a belt. You tied a piece of rawhide if they started slipping, and when they ripped, you stitched them with whatever thread you had, or borrowed wire, or didn't stitch them at all. Then came the armor of the range. Chaps. Not for looks, not for flair, not because they flapped dramatically when you walked into a saloon. You wore them because thorn bushes, barbed wire, and angry cattle didn't care how much you paid for your pants. Chaps were thick leather, often cowhide, sometimes rough cut. You buckled them around your waist and thighs. They were hot, awkward, and smelled like a tannery. But they saved your legs, which meant you kept your skin, and by extension, your job. And let's not forget your boots. Cowboy boots weren't soft, weren't comfortable, and certainly weren't made for walking. They were made for riding. High-heeled to stay in the stirrups, pointed at the toe so you could slide your foot in quick. And the leather? Stiff enough to scrape bark off a tree. No insulation, no waterproofing. And after a day in the snow or mud, they turned into stiff, frozen casings, like wearing two angry tree trunks. Getting them off at night was a battle. Getting them on again in the morning was a war. You didn't have socks, you had sock. Singular, maybe two, and they were never dry. Just slightly less damp than yesterday. Then there was the hat. Ah, the cowboy hat. Romanticized, mythologized, and totally necessary. Not because it made you look cool, but because it was the only thing standing between you and sunstroke, snow blindness, or brain freeze. It shaded your face, shielded your eyes, caught rainwater for your horse. You used it as a bowl, a pillow, a fan, a weapon if needed. And if you lost it, well, good luck. Because squinting into the desert sun with no cover was a fast track to seeing your ancestors before you were ready. A real cowboy's hat was stained with sweat, bent at the edges, cracked at the crown. It told stories, none of them pleasant. But it stayed on your head, even in wind that could strip bark off a pine tree. That hat mattered. And finally, your bandana. Not a fashion statement, a necessity. You wore it over your mouth to block dust, pulled it up in winter to keep the wind from slicing your lips, dipped it in water, and tied it around your neck when the heat got bad. Used it as a bandage, a rag, a filter, or a signal. Some cowboys died with nothing on their body but a knife, a hat, and a red bandana. It was that useful. But for all the hardship of what you wore, there was one truth harder than any boot leather. You never really got warm. Not in the winter, not under the stars, not when the fire died. Because when you finally stopped riding, after miles of cold wind and saddle bruises, you didn't walk into a cabin or a tent or anything resembling shelter. You made camp. Shelter? That was your coat, your saddle, maybe a brush lean-to if you were feeling ambitious. You might stack some branches, throw your tarp over them, and crawl inside like a miserable raccoon. But most nights, you just dropped your bedroll on the ground and prayed the wind didn't shift. The ground was your bed. The sky was your ceiling. The coyotes were your neighbors. You didn't have a tent. Cowboys didn't carry tents. Too bulky, too heavy. And besides, what good would canvas do in a windstorm when the cold was already inside your bones? You rolled out your bedding, a couple blankets wrapped in canvas, and laid it near the fire. Or where the fire used to be, before you forgot to stoke it, and now it's a ring of cold stones and betrayal. You lay down, boots on or off depending on how frozen they were. Hat pulled low, duster wrapped tight. And you didn't expect comfort. You expected survival. The wind moaned, the stars watched, and the prairie turned its shoulder to you like a host that never wanted guests in the first place. That was cowboy shelter. Not four walls, not a roof, just you, your coat, and the overwhelming, endless silence of the wild. And somehow, you woke up the next day and did it all over again. The cowboy was never idle. From the moment your boots hit the ground, cold, cracked, and probably still wet from yesterday, the day grabbed you by the collar and dragged you forward. Cowboys didn't have days off. They had chores, and then jobs, and then emergencies. And if you were lucky, you got to sleep before something else broke. Your body always hurt. Your muscles felt like old rope, stretched too thin, pulled too hard. You limped more often than you walked. You didn't mention it. If your back gave out, someone else got your pay. And pay? That was a laugh. Let's talk about the work first. The drive. If you were on a cattle drive, you were waking up before the sun, already stiff and sore from the night before. You didn't ease into the morning. You mounted into it, groaning as your legs wrapped around a horse that also hadn't slept properly. The herd waited, and it wasn't waiting politely. Hundreds, sometimes thousands, of longhorn cattle spread out over the prairie like a living, snorting carpet of muscle and chaos. Your job? Keep them moving, keep them together, keep them alive. That meant riding in circles, for hours, in dust storms, rainstorms, snow, and unbearable heat. You rode flank or drag. Flank meant darting alongside skittish cattle, nudging them back when they drifted. Drag meant eating the full force of the dust, manure, and misery at the rear. If one cow broke off, you chased it. If one calf fell behind, you lifted it, by hand if you had to, back to the herd. If the whole herd spooked, you ran for your life. Because stampedes didn't care who you were. If a loud noise or a lightning strike set those animals off, they'd bolt like a river of bone and fury. You could hear it coming, the low, thunderous rumble of thousands of hooves shaking the earth. The air itself would vibrate, and suddenly your only job was to stay alive. You'd ride hard, harder than you thought possible, yelling, cracking your whip, waving your hat, trying anything to turn the lead steers in a circle and spin the stampede into a spiral before it ran itself into a canyon or a cliff. Cowboys died in stampedes, trampled, crushed, vanished. 1 second you're there, next second, just dust and hoof prints, and then the rest of the herd had to be rounded up. Again. And you still hadn't eaten camp work. If you weren't on a drive, you were on the ranch. But don't let the word ranch fool you. It wasn't a peaceful patch of green pasture and a wooden house with a porch swing. It was a sprawl of land too big to fence, too empty to feel safe, and too busy to rest. There were fences to mend, and barbed wire wasn't a luxury. It was a cruel joke. It tore your gloves. It shredded your arms. It rusted, broke, sagged, and needed constant care. There were horses to shoe, a delicate, dangerous task. One wrong move and you caught a hoof to the chest or got your hand pinned between the anvil and the horse's sudden mood. There were barns to patch, feed to haul, and manure to shovel, because even the stink had to be managed. You rode out checking the herd, sometimes for miles, in snow, in wind, in sleet. You looked for broken legs, blood, predators, or signs of theft. Cattle rustlers were real, and they weren't shy. If they thought your ranch was vulnerable, they'd sneak in, drive off a dozen head, and vanish into the brush before you even lit your morning fire. You had to be part farmer, part tracker, part detective, part gunslinger. And when the work was done, it wasn't. Because the tools needed oiling, the rope needed coiling, the wagon wheel broke, again. The horse was limping. The fence you fixed last week was blown down in last night's storm. And by the time you looked up, the sun was setting. Your tools, you didn't have a lot. But what you had mattered. Your rope or lariat was your lifeline, coiled on your saddle, always ready. You practiced throwing it until your arm felt like it would fall off. Because if you missed a roping, you didn't just lose a cow. You might lose your job, or your partner, or yourself. Your knife was always on your belt, used for everything. Cutting wire, slicing jerky, picking your teeth, cleaning fish, fighting off a coyote. A good knife was worth more than a week's wages. Your rifle or revolver, always nearby. Not because you were planning a shootout, but because the wild was wild. Wolves, mountain lions, bears, bandits, or even just a cow that turned on you and came charging with horns down and murder in its eyes. Most deaths on the range weren't dramatic. They were stupid, quick, unexpected. A bad fall from a horse, a kicked head, a crushed rib cage, a hidden snake in a sleeping bag. You learned early to respect the land, the animals, and your own clumsiness, because everything could kill you if you weren't paying attention. Survival beyond work. Water wasn't easy. You couldn't just turn a faucet. You looked for streams, carried canteens, watched your horse for signs of thirst. You boiled when you could. You drank mud when you couldn't. Food? We've already talked about beans. But some days there were no beans. You hunted rabbits. You tried to fish. You scraped jerky off a hide so tough it felt like chewing rawhide. And you rationed coffee like it was gold dust. Sleep came in short bursts. You napped in the saddle, dozed by the fire, fell asleep mid-conversation, sometimes mid-chew. You learned to function with 5 hours, then 4, then none. Your body stopped asking for comfort. It just asked to not stop. Because in cowboy life, rest was rare. And survival wasn't glamorous. It was sweat, pain, motion, and scars. The big lie. The truth most folks never heard? Cowboys didn't ride off into the sunset. They rode into the cold, into the wind, into back-breaking days of hauling, chasing, bleeding, and hoping the storm didn't come early. There was no reward at the end, no applause. Just another day, another mile, another calf tangled in barbed wire, another night in a bedroll that smelled like desperation. You weren't a hero. You weren't a legend. You were a laborer, a hard-bitten, saddle-worn, dust-covered piece of the machine that kept the West moving. And you did it not for glory, not for romance, but because you had to, because this was the work, and the work never stopped. You might think cowboys were tough enough to laugh at gods, but they weren't. Not really. Out on the open range, where storms rolled in like fists and men died without warning, belief was not a luxury. It was a necessity, a kind of armor for the soul. When the land doesn't care if you live or die, you start looking for someone who does. And so cowboys believed. In God, yes. In saints sometimes. But also in omens, curses, signs, spirits, and the endless invisible rules that made no sense but were followed because they had to be. The prairie was not just wide and wild, it was haunted. Not with ghosts in the sheet and chain sense, but with presence, with old energy, with strange luck that could shift like a breeze. So a cowboy kept a kind of private religion. Not always the church kind, but always something. The cowboy and God. Most cowboys were at least culturally Christian, whether Catholic or Protestant. They carried Bibles in their saddlebags, tiny, worn, thumbed-through copies wrapped in twine and stained with sweat. Not because they were preachers, but because out there you needed something to pray to when your horse broke a leg 30 miles from help. They didn't go to church. There was no church. So instead, they talked to God by firelight. Simple prayers, quiet thanks, mumbled bargains. They didn't ask for riches. They asked for rain, for a safe ride across the river, for the storm to hold off just one more night. And when someone died, and someone always did, you marked the grave with a cross of sticks, said a few clumsy words, and hoped God was listening, even if no one else was. Cowboys weren't theologians, but they were believers. And belief, in a place that tried every day to break you, was one of the only things you could carry without adding weight to your saddle. Saints, psalms, and penance. Catholic cowboys, especially those of Mexican, Spanish, or French descent, often wore small medals of saints tucked under their shirts. Saint Christopher, the patron of travelers. Saint Joseph, for strength. Our Lady of Guadalupe, for protection. These weren't decoration. They were shields. You kissed them before a river crossing, clutched them in the dark when your partner was coughing up blood beside the fire, whispered to them when you got lost. Some cowboys muttered psalms like mantras, not out loud, not for show, just quietly, repeating lines they half remembered from childhood. Yea, though I walk through the valley of the shadow of death. Out there, that didn't feel metaphorical. It felt like Tuesday. And if something bad happened, your horse spooked, your rope snapped, your fire wouldn't light, you didn't shrug it off. You took it personally. You figured you'd done something wrong, said the wrong thing, slept facing the wrong direction. Stepped on some kind of invisible boundary. You didn't know the rules, but you knew when they'd been broken. So you made your peace however you could. Superstition was survival. The wild didn't come with a manual, so cowboys made their own rules. Superstitions. Folk laws passed from mouth to ear like sacred truth. Things that sounded ridiculous in daylight but felt urgent under a full moon. Never put your hat on a bed. Bad luck. Could mean death. Don't light 3 cigarettes with 1 match. Tempting fate. It was said the third man would die before the week was out. Never ride out before your horse finishes a drink. Disrespectful. Could sour the ride. If an owl hooted near camp, someone would die. No one laughed. You just went quiet. Maybe added a little more wood to the fire. Salt spilled? Toss it over your left shoulder. First snake of spring? Spit 3 times. Some swore by lucky coins, rabbit's feet, charms sewn into hat bands. Others kept small pouches of herbs gifted by a grandmother or a wandering healer. Sage, tobacco, even animal bones. Not magic exactly, just precaution. Because the land didn't explain itself, and cowboys didn't expect it to. They just followed the signs. Death was always watching. Cowboys lived with death, ate beside it, rode next to it, slept with it curled at their feet like a cold dog. So they made rules. Never talk about death after sundown. Invites it. Never dig a grave unless you have to. Might be digging your own. Never leave your boots pointing toward the fire. That's how dead men sleep. When someone died on the trail, you turned their boots backward in the stirrups as you led their riderless horse back to camp. It was the final image of a man leaving the world. And at night, you didn't joke about dying. You just poked the fire, pulled your hat low, and hoped you'd wake up in the morning. Because belief wasn't always hopeful. Sometimes it was just fear with a ritual attached. Animals knew things. Ask any cowboy worth his salt, and he'd tell you, animals saw what men didn't. If your horse refused to cross a stream for no good reason, you didn't argue. Maybe it smelled something. Maybe it sensed something. Maybe there was nothing at all. But you still found another path. Dogs growled at empty space. Time to move camp. Cattle refused to graze in a patch of grass. You didn't ask why. Some said horses could see ghosts. Others claimed coyotes carried the voices of the dead. And ravens? No one liked ravens. Not out here. If you saw one perched near your bedroll, you tied your saddle tighter and said a few words to anything that might be listening. Because when nature starts acting strange, a smart cowboy doesn't ask questions. He listens. Witch signs and the weird stuff, and then there were the things you didn't talk about. Not unless the fire was low and the whiskey strong. Witch signs carved in trees, dreams that came true. Cold spots in the desert that never warmed. The West had its fair share of folklore, and cowboys carried it with them like old bullet wounds. Some talked of a ghost herd, phantom cattle that stampeded across the plains on moonless nights, led by a rider with glowing eyes. Others claimed to see lights dancing over mesas, or heard voices whispering their name when no one else was awake. No one claimed to believe. But everyone had a story. You'd ride past places that didn't feel right. Maybe a dead tree split in a way that looked too much like a man. Maybe a canyon that echoed back in the wrong tone. Maybe a patch of land where nothing grew and no animal ever passed through. You didn't linger. You didn't ask. You just rode on. And if someone asked why your hair was standing up, you said it was the wind. Belief was the blanket. It wasn't about logic. It wasn't even about faith, always. It was about control. The illusion of it, at least. When you slept under the open sky with wolves howling and wind cutting through your coat like a blade, you needed to believe that something was on your side. So you whispered a prayer. You tossed salt. You watched the stars and avoided the one that flickered wrong. You folded your coat just so, turned your hat brim west, and kept your knife close. Because even if none of it mattered, out there, it felt like everything did. You've worked all day, your back aches, your hands sting, your boots are full of mud, and your stomach sounds like it's trying to start a fight. It's finally time to eat, not because it's dinner time. That's a city concept, a clock concept. Out here, you eat when the work's done and you're too tired to care if it's still daylight. You settle by the fire, if there is a fire, and eye the pot that's been simmering for the last hour. Let's talk about what's in that pot. Beans, always beans. Cowboy food wasn't cooked. It was assembled, heated until vaguely edible, and eaten fast before the flies got to it. And beans were king. Pinto beans, navy beans, black beans, whatever was cheap and dried and could survive months in a saddlebag without growing something fuzzy. They were soaked, when water was available, and boiled in a big cast iron pot over the fire. No spices, no flair. Just beans, salt, and maybe a scrap of salt pork if someone was feeling generous. They were mushy, bland, and smelled like wet burlap. But they were filling. They stuck to your ribs. They kept your bowels moving just enough to avoid catastrophe, until they didn't. Because beans weren't just food. They were dangerous. The more you ate, the more pressure built in your gut. You learned quickly to sleep with a little distance between yourself and your fellow cowboys. The campfire symphony wasn't for the faint of heart or nose. And let's not forget that if you messed up the soaking or reheated yesterday's pot wrong, you'd be praying to both God and your bedroll by midnight. Hardtack, jerky, and regret. Next up on the cowboy menu, hardtack. A biscuit in name only, hardtack was basically flour, water, and regret baked into a brick and left to petrify. You'd bang it on your saddle horn to test it. If it didn't break, you'd try to soak it in your coffee. If it still didn't soften, you'd gnaw it like a desperate beaver and hope your teeth were up to the challenge. Many cowboys lost more to hardtack than to gunfights. And jerky, dried strips of beef or buffalo or whatever animal you could kill and slice thin enough, was a staple. Chewy, salty, sometimes moldy. You learned not to ask what the meat used to be. Just be glad it didn't crawl off your plate. Rusty coffee and dirty cups, you always had coffee. Even if you had no food, coffee was more than a drink. It was a lifeline, a signal to your bones that they weren't dead yet. You boiled it in a blackened tin pot until it smelled like a railroad tie and tasted like ash. No sugar, no cream, no filters. You drank it hot, fast, and usually with a mouthful of grounds. Some cowboys tried to swirl the cup before sipping to sink the grit. Others just swallowed and accepted their fate. Your cup? Rarely washed. Just swished out with a bit of yesterday's leftover, maybe wiped on your pants, and reused until it rusted through or vanished under your saddle. Still, that first sip in the evening felt like salvation. That last sip, usually lukewarm and gritty, felt like punishment. Such was cowboy balance. Spoilage, parasites, and regret there was no refrigeration. If you had meat and didn't eat it fast, it turned on you. And it did so quickly. You learned to tell when something smelled a little off versus definitely lethal. Sometimes you got it wrong. Stomach aches were common. So was vomiting. Diarrhea could take down a cowboy faster than a bullet. Dehydration was no joke, and your canteen only held so much. You didn't trust the water, so you boiled it. You didn't trust the meat, so you overcooked it. And you didn't trust anything green unless you picked it yourself. But sometimes, desperation overrode caution. You've probably eaten something today that would kill a modern stomach in 30 minutes flat. A gray piece of meat, a half-wormed biscuit, or a cup of coffee with floating surprises. And you'll do it again tomorrow. Because cowboys weren't foodies. They were survivors. Tavern nights and town meals. When you did get to town, which was rare, it was a celebration. Sort of. You'd ride in dusty, stiff, and stinking, and head straight for the nearest tavern or saloon. There you might finally get a real meal. Steak, overcooked. Eggs, rubbery. Potatoes, if you were lucky. Whiskey, if you were even luckier. The food wasn't better, just different. It came on a plate. It was handed to you by someone else. You didn't have to chase it, kill it, or stir it until it stopped moving. You sat at a table, on a chair, with 4 legs. You could almost pretend you weren't a wild creature anymore. But only almost, because the food cost money, and cowboys didn't have much. Most lived on $25 or $40 a month, and a good night at the saloon could burn half of it in one sitting. So you savored the plate. You sipped the drink, and you promised to ride hard tomorrow. Entertainment, such as it was. Cowboys didn't party, not really, but they did unwind. Around the fire there'd be storytelling, mostly lies told in slow drawls, punctuated by long silences and the occasional grunt. Someone might bring out a harmonica or a battered guitar, a song or two, half remembered, maybe Home on the Range or Red River Valley. Voices cracked, melodies wandered, but no one complained. Laughter happened, but it was rare, quiet, like a cough in a church. You might play cards, poker, usually, using bullets or beans as chips. Sometimes you'd bet your tobacco, or your boots, or your horse, and sometimes you'd lose them. And then there were fights, not barroom brawls with chairs flying and dramatic piano crashes, just short, mean bursts of frustration. A punch, a knee, a tackle into the mud. Then it was over. Blood on the lip. Apologies muttered. Back to the fire. Because you still had to ride together in the morning. Festivals and frontier fun. If you were near a settlement during a festival, you might see dancing, parades, maybe a preacher shouting over a fiddler, kids running around barefoot, women with flowers in their hair, cowboys awkwardly standing at the edge, not quite sure how to exist in normal society anymore. You might dance if you remembered how. You might try to flirt, though you likely smelled like old leather and sweat. And you might drink too much, laugh too hard, and wake up the next morning on the wrong side of a fence, missing a boot, and owing someone a chicken. That's how fun looked on the frontier. Strange, brief, and slightly dangerous. So yes, cowboys had meals, cowboys had entertainment. But none of it was fancy. Most of it wasn't even comfortable. Food was fuel. Fun was a flicker. And every minute you spent not working felt like it might be stolen back by the trail tomorrow. It didn't take a bullet to kill a cowboy. It didn't take an outlaw, a shootout, or a dramatic final ride. Most of the time, death came quietly, on a cold wind, in a dirty cut, in a bad cough that just wouldn't quit. Out on the trail, illness was everywhere, and medicine was more of a theory than a science. You learned quickly that the body wasn't something you owned. It was something you bargained with, and the house always won. The constant companions, sickness and infection. Cowboys were strong. They had to be, but they weren't immune. The biggest threats weren't gunfights. They were names you whispered at night like curses. Dysentery, pneumonia, tuberculosis, typhoid, lockjaw, gangrene. Sometimes it started with a cough. Dry, persistent, harmless. Then came the fever, then the sweat, then the silence. A lot of cowboys died without even knowing what they had. They just got tired. Too tired to sit a horse, too tired to eat, then too tired to wake up. A scratch from barbed wire? That could mean tetanus, what they called lockjaw. Your jaw stiffens, your muscles seize, your back arches, and then you stop breathing. No cure, no hospital, no mercy. Even a toothache, a tiny, annoying throb, could mean an abscess. That infection could climb to your brain and end you within days. No dentist on the prairie. Just whiskey and a knife, if someone was brave enough to pull the tooth before it got worse. You bled when you shouldn't. You vomited what you couldn't name. And when the wind cut into your lungs, it stayed there. Cold, deep, permanent. The doctor may be worse. There were doctors in the West, sometimes. But let's be clear, many were little more than barbers with extra confidence. A frontier doctor might have studied in a real medical school, or maybe he just apprenticed under a guy named Clem who owned a saw and a bottle of bourbon. There were no antibiotics, no antiseptics, no understanding of bacteria. If you were lucky, your wound got wrapped in clean rags. If you weren't, they used whatever was lying around. Old shirts, saddle blankets, even leaves. Surgery was creative. You lay on a table, bit down on leather, and screamed into your hat while they sawed, stitched, or cauterized. Anesthetics were optional, usually unavailable. Maybe some laudanum, a tincture of opium and alcohol. Enough to fog your mind, not enough to dull the agony. If your leg got crushed, they cut it off with a bone saw, while your friends held you down. Survive that, and infection might still get you before morning. And if the doctor wasn't around, the cook might try. Or the trail boss, with steady hands, but no real knowledge. Or worst of all, you. You'd clean the wound yourself, heat the blade in the fire, cut away the bad flesh, stitch it shut with thread, and spit and sheer desperation. Remedies, charms, and wild hopes. When medicine failed, and it often did, you turned to whatever else you had. That meant herbs, folk cures, superstition. Chew willow bark for pain. Rub tobacco on a wound. Boil sage for tea. Make a poultice from mashed onions or honey or lard mixed with dirt and hope. Was it effective? Sometimes. Just enough to keep trying. Cowboys carried little bottles of tonic, cheap, over-the-counter elixirs promising to cure everything from coughing to heartbreak. Most were just alcohol, opium, or turpentine in pretty glass. You took a swig, felt warm, and believed you were better. Faith was part of the cure, even if it didn't work. Some wore lucky charms to ward off sickness, pieces of bone, coins rubbed smooth, a saint's medal, a silver cross. And when all else failed, you lay in your bedroll, too weak to move, listening to the fire pop, waiting to see if your body would decide to keep going. The fear that never left. You didn't talk about it. Not really. But every cowboy lived with fear. The kind that crept in when the coughing started. The kind that twisted in your gut when you saw red in the snow after a fall. The kind that turned your bowels to water when your friend went quiet and didn't wake up the next morning. There was no 911, no ambulance, no sterile white room where people rushed to save you. There was just you. And if you were lucky, someone else's hands holding your shoulders while you shook and sweated and tried to breathe. Cowboys didn't cry about death, but they felt it. Every time they saddled up, every time they crossed a river swollen with spring melt, every time they swallowed coffee that tasted a little too sour. You never knew what would get you. You just hoped it wouldn't be today. Burial on the range. When a cowboy died, he didn't get a funeral. He got a hole in the ground, dug with whatever tools were nearby, an old spade, a boot heel, a pocket knife. If there was time, someone said a prayer, maybe quoted a Bible verse, maybe just stared into the fire and nodded. You wrapped the body in canvas, buried it shallow or deep, depending on how frozen the ground was, marked the spot with stones or sticks, and then you rode on. Sometimes you carved a name, sometimes just Rider, because out there, under the wide, empty sky, death was part of the job. Why you kept going. So why do it? Why keep riding? Keep risking? Keep waking up with that cough, that ache, that fear? Because there wasn't a choice. This was the life. You didn't change it. You endured it. You rode with pain, ate with fever, wrapped yourself in blankets and hoped for one more sunrise. And sometimes you got it, and sometimes you didn't. But as long as your boots hit the ground and your horse was standing, you kept going. Because the cowboy's medicine wasn't in a bottle. It was in motion. You don't see many women on the trail. You might go weeks, months, without hearing a woman's voice, unless it's a memory curling through your brain in the middle of a long, lonely ride. Out here, women weren't part of the day-to-day cowboy world, not because they didn't belong, because survival didn't make space for comfort. But they existed, and their absence was loud. The women left behind. Most cowboys didn't ride for glory. They rode because there was nothing left back home. Maybe you were the youngest son on a dead farm. Maybe your father drank too much. Maybe your mother begged you not to go, but you went anyway because you needed a job more than you needed affection. Some left wives, children, a brother in a shallow grave, and a baby still learning to walk. You carried them with you, not in a picture. Cowboys rarely had those. but in the way you muttered under your breath, the way you stared into the fire too long, the way you flinched when someone mentioned family. You didn't talk about them, not because you didn't care, because it hurt. The ranch wives out on the ranches, the real ones, the permanent ones. Women ran the world behind the barn doors. They weren't sitting on porches in bonnets. They were chopping wood, hauling water, plucking chickens, patching shirts, birthing children, burying children, and still setting a hot meal on the table before the sun was down. Their hands were cracked. Their backs were bowed. Their eyes were tired. And still, they worked. A ranch wife could ride as hard as any man. She could fire a rifle with steadier aim, deliver a baby with no help, mend a saddle, break a colt, and sew a funeral dress in one long, aching day. She was nurse, teacher, cook, and undertaker, and most of the time, she didn't complain, because no one would listen anyway. Women on the move. A few women did ride the trail, cooks mostly, or widows who refused to remarry. Sometimes women who dressed as men just to stay alive, and no one asked questions because they could rope and ride just as well. And yes, soiled doves, the euphemism for prostitutes, followed the railroads, the cattle drives, the paydays. They worked in tents, in shacks, in back rooms behind the saloon. Their lives were hard, short, and judged from every angle. Cowboys didn't fall in love often. And when they did, they usually did it too fast, too awkwardly, and too late. A warm voice, a hand on your arm, someone who didn't smell like horse and desperation. It could ruin you, or save you, sometimes both. But most cowboys knew better than to ask for more than a night. Mother was a ghost. She was the soft memory, back when your world smelled like bread and soap and warm dirt, before the trail, before the wait, before you learned what it meant to watch a man die and feel nothing but the ache in your knees from kneeling too long. You remembered her hands, her voice, the way she tucked in your shirt and told you to stand straight. Now your shirt hasn't been tucked in for years, and your back curves like a question mark. But when you wake up from a fever dream, shaking and mumbling, it's not your trail boss you're calling for. It's her. Children didn't stay. Children long. You didn't grow up on the frontier. You just got tall. Kids worked. Period. Boys helped herd cattle, mend fences, drive wagons, clean stalls. Girls hauled water, washed clothes, churned butter, baked bread, scraped hide from old bones, and held their baby siblings while their mother was in labor. A 10-year-old knew more about death than most modern adults. A 12-year-old might be married. A 13-year-old might be dead. There was no school unless your family was rich or near a town, or your mother happened to be literate and tired enough to try teaching between cooking and childbirth. Toys were sticks, bones, bits of rope, maybe a wooden doll if your father had a soft moment and a sharp knife. Play was short. Laughter was brief. Childhood was a flicker, then it was gone. Birth was a gamble. So was love. Childbirth was brutal, bloody, and often lethal. You didn't call for a doctor. You called for the neighbor woman, 10 miles away, who'd seen enough births to know what wasn't right. You boiled water. You prayed. And you hoped it wasn't a breach. If the baby came out screaming, you wept with joy. If it didn't, you wrapped it in linen, dug a hole, and moved on before your tears froze to your cheeks. Women died in childbirth like men died in cattle stampedes, sudden, tragic, and too often to count. Love? That was harder. If you found it, you held on tight. You didn't expect it to look like the novels. There were no sonnets, no candlelit letters. Love looked like sharing your last biscuit, like holding her hair back while she vomited from fever, like coming back after the trail when you didn't have to. Family was survival. You didn't stay together because it was easy. You stayed because it was necessary. A wife wasn't just a partner. She was your team, your cook, your medic, your counselor. You didn't argue about feelings. You argued about firewood and corn. Children weren't coddled. They were trained. They helped keep the house standing, the animals alive, the food from rotting. They watched their parents with wide eyes and learned quickly what happened when mistakes were made. Still, there were moments, a child asleep in your lap after a long ride, a woman humming while she scrubbed the table, a family gathered in one room while the wind screamed outside and the fire crackled low. You might not have had much, but in that moment, you had everything. What the cowboy gave up. Every cowboy who left for the trail gave up something. A woman he didn't write to often enough. A child whose birthday he forgot again. A mother who waited for a letter until her hands couldn't open the envelope anymore. The world told him to be tough, but in the quiet, with nothing but the moon overhead and a half-empty cup of coffee in his hand, he remembered. He always remembered. Because the truth no one said out loud was this: every cowboy missed someone. Afternoon, the time when the sun shifts, the shadows stretch long, and your body begins to revolt. You've been riding for hours. Your knees ache. Your hands are stiff. The wind hasn't let up, and neither has the work. This is when tempers break, because the cowboy life wasn't just lonely, it was tense. A group of men, sleep-deprived, cold, blistered, and packed into an open wilderness like mules in a pen, doesn't always stay civil. When you're out in the elements, misery becomes contagious. One man's bad mood turns into a second man's mistake, turns into a third man's black eye. Physical limits. Pushed too far. By afternoon, you're running on fumes. Your body screams with every step. Your horse knows you're exhausted. He can feel it in your seat, your posture, your hesitation. Your lips are cracked from sun and wind. Your stomach churns from that spoiled salt pork. Your hat doesn't shade you like it used to, and your boots have rubbed your ankles raw. But you keep moving, because if you stop, you fall behind. And if you fall behind, the herd moves without you. And if the herd's gone, you're just a man alone in a desert, with nothing but dust and a slowly forming regret that maybe your mother was right when she said you should have been a teacher. But by now, even regret feels like luxury. Rough hierarchies and hard men. There was no democracy on the trail, no shared vote. You followed orders or you got out of the way. At the top of the food chain was the trail boss. His word was law. You didn't argue with the trail boss. If you did, you'd better be ready to ride somewhere else, and soon. The men respected strength, but more than that, they respected a man who kept the drive moving. Beneath him was the ramrod, second in command. usually meaner, quieter. He didn't ask twice. Then came the point riders, swing riders, flank riders, and the dreaded drag, the lowest spot on the herd, where the dust choked you and the stink never left your clothes. At the very bottom, the cook, though ironically, he held more power than most. Make the men sick? You'd be strung up. Make them something halfway decent. You might be treated like royalty. And the wrangler, the youngest, the newest, the poorest, tended the horses. He was usually covered in mud, rope burns, and self-doubt. Everyone yelled at the wrangler. It was practically part of the job. Racial divides and social walls, cowboy life has been whitewashed by myth. But the reality, it was deeply segregated, and the lines were often brutal. 1 in 4 cowboys was black. Many were formerly enslaved men, freed after the Civil War, with few options and sharp skills with a horse. They were respected for their work, but rarely treated as equals. They got paid less, slept farther from camp, were often given the worst horses, the worst food, and the last word, if they were allowed to speak at all. Mexican vaqueros were some of the most skilled riders in the West. Much of the cowboy trade, lassoing, roping, riding techniques, even the word rodeo, came from them. But they too were pushed aside, talked down to, and treated as foreign help, even when the white cowboys learned everything from them. Native cowboys existed too, especially in later years, when tribes were forced onto reservations and men sought whatever work they could find. They rode well, worked hard, and were barely acknowledged. Prejudice wasn't subtle. It was baked in. A black cowboy could ride 1,000 miles beside you, save your life in a river crossing, and still be banned from the saloon when you reached town. And you? You didn't challenge it. Not out of agreement, but because survival left little room for moral crusades. You were just trying to make it to the next fire. Arguments, fights, and frontier justice. By mid-afternoon, the heat sets in. Even in winter, the sun can bake your brain when you're exposed for too long. Cowboys got sun sickness. Confused, dizzy, angry. Combine that with hunger, saddle sores, and another man's attitude. Now you've got a fight. Disputes started small. A stolen biscuit, a stepped-on bedroll, a borrowed knife that wasn't returned. But they could turn fast, and fists weren't the only weapons on hand. Knives, hammers, ropes, firewood, a skillet if you were desperate. And guns, they were everywhere, but rarely used in fights between cowboys. Drawing steel was serious business. If you pulled your revolver, you'd better be ready to kill or die. There were no warning shots. Still, fights happened, often, and justice was usually delivered right there on the spot. If you were caught stealing, you might be whipped or run out of camp. Caught lying, shunned permanently. Caught endangering the herd, you might be beaten, or worse. There were no police, no court, just the men and the fire, and whatever punishment they agreed upon between gritted teeth and clenched fists. Loneliness turns to anger. Sometimes the fights weren't even about anything real. Sometimes it was just the grit in your skin and the weight on your shoulders. You missed your family. You hadn't slept. The same man had been humming the same 2 notes for 4 days straight, and you just snapped. And when it was over, you'd sit apart from the group, nursing your busted lip, wondering if it was worth it. It never was. But anger was easier than sadness. And sometimes, pain was the only thing that made you feel awake. Nature's cruel afternoon tricks afternoon was when the weather turned. A blue sky in the morning could become a storm in minutes. Dust storms rolled in like monsters, blotting out the sun, stripping skin from faces. You'd cover your mouth with your bandana, bury your eyes in your elbow, and still come out coughing up grit for days. Cold snaps would descend mid-ride. 1 minute sweat's dripping from your neck. The next, you're pulling your coat tight against sudden cutting wind. And lightning? It struck the highest point. Out on the plains, that was often you. Social exhaustion. Afternoon was also when you got tired of pretending, tired of conversation, tired of hearing the same old stories, tired of everyone's voice, including your own. You didn't want to talk about women, or towns, or God, or politics, or war. Not anymore. You just wanted silence. But silence could be dangerous too. Made you think too much. Made you remember things you'd been trying to forget since Missouri. So you kept your eyes on the trail. You whistled. You sang. You cursed. Anything to keep your mind from turning on you. And still, you kept riding. Because the cattle were still moving. The sun was still up. And quitting? That wasn't part of the deal. You could cry later. Bleed later. Rage later. For now, there was a ridge ahead, a stream to cross, and a few more hours of daylight to survive. And that was enough. The sun drops fast in the west. 1 minute you're blinking at the heat, the dust, the cattle turning golden in the late light. And the next, everything is shadows. Blue, then black. Night doesn't drift in. It falls, heavy, cold, absolute. And when it does, everything changes. Because night is when the cowboy's world shrinks. The wide plains, the endless sky, the hills on the horizon, they all disappear. What's left is your fire, your horse, your breath hanging in the air, and the fear you don't speak aloud. The fire is never big enough. You don't build a bonfire. Big fires attract attention, from animals, from strangers, from things you might not want seeing you. So you build it small, close, just enough to boil coffee and warm your boots. It crackles quietly, snapping every so often like it's trying to speak. You sit beside it, staring into the flames, your hands raw, your shoulders slumped. The light dances across your face and turns your coat into shadow. Your hat brim makes your eyes vanish. And the silence around you, it's not peaceful. It's watchful. The dangers you can hear. Coyotes sing first. Their howls drift through the dark like laughter you don't understand. One starts, then two, then more. A whole choir of teeth and bone calling out just beyond the fire's reach. They won't come close, probably, not unless they're starving. But something might. Mountain lions didn't make noise, not until they were on you. A blur in the dark, a scream in your ear, and claws in your back. Wolves were worse, smarter, hungrier. quieter. If you were lucky, your horse would warn you, ears up, snorting, stomping, turning toward the threat. And if you weren't lucky, you'd wake up too late. Even the rattlesnakes didn't sleep soundly. They curled up in your boots, slid through your bedroll, or stretched across the trail, just waiting to be stepped on by the only man not watching his feet. So you listened to every twig snap, every breeze, every creak of saddle leather, every whinny from your horse. Because at night, your ears replaced your eyes. And if you couldn't hear death coming, you weren't ready, the dangers you can't hear. Animals weren't the only threat. Men were worse. Bandits, thieves, drifters with nothing left to lose. If they found your camp, they might take your horse, your gear, your boots, maybe your life, maybe just your name. You didn't trust strangers after dark. You didn't call out. You didn't wave. You put your hand near your pistol and hoped you wouldn't have to use it. Because gunfire at night didn't end clean. It echoed for miles and drew more trouble. And if the man who wandered into your firelight looked wrong, dead eyes, nervous hands, blood on his shirt, you didn't ask questions. You just reached for your gear and found another place to sleep. Because cowboys had a rule: better alone than dead. The cold is the real killer. If nothing found you, the cold might. Even in summer, desert nights could drop below freezing. In winter, you felt it in your bones before the sun even set. You curled into your bedroll like a child hiding from nightmares, pulled your duster tight around your legs, tucked your hands into your armpits, breathed slow to keep the heat in. But it didn't stay. The ground beneath you felt like stone. Your breath froze in your mustache. Your teeth started chattering before your eyes closed. And if it got bad enough, you stopped shivering. That's when you knew you were in trouble. Some cowboys just didn't wake up. No wound, no sickness, just frozen from the inside out. Your horse would stand there blinking, waiting for the man who would never mount again. Nightmares come easier out here. And when you did sleep, it wasn't easy. Dreams weren't soft. They came sharp, fast, wild. You dreamed of old gunfights, of wolves with red eyes, of rivers you couldn't cross, of towns you'd left behind, and faces you never wanted to see again. You dreamed of home, and that was often worse, because it wasn't real. You'd wake with a jolt, gasping, reaching for something that wasn't there. Then you'd lie still, staring up at a sky so black it looked bottomless, and you'd wonder, am I still dreaming? Other men, other camps. Sometimes you weren't alone. Sometimes there were others by the fire. A full crew. A circle of cowboys passing a bottle, mumbling stories, playing cards under lantern light. But even then, it wasn't safe. Not really. Because everyone's tired. Everyone's sore. Everyone's carrying something they don't talk about. And sometimes, in the middle of a joke, a man's smile fades and he just stops. He stares into the fire. You don't ask why. You've done it too. Everyone out here is running from something. A past, a mistake, a face in the mirror. And at night, when the world quiets, that thing catches up, the sky watches, but doesn't help. The stars are too many to count, too bright to ignore. You lie there, eyes open, staring up, wondering how a sky so full can make you feel so empty. The moon offers no warmth, no comfort. It just watches. And if you pray, you do it silently. No words, just hope, just breath. Because out here it feels like the land forgot your name, and the sky never knew it. Death feels close, because it is. Not just in the physical sense. Though yes, everything can kill you, but also in the spiritual sense. Like death is a presence, a thing that walks the range at night, quiet as a whisper, cold as a memory. You've lost men to it. A stampede, a snakebite, a fever, a fall. One day they're riding beside you. The next, their saddle is empty. Their name is mumbled once or twice, then nothing. You don't cry. You don't mourn. Not out loud. But in the dark, as the fire dies and your boots cool by the stone ring, you feel it. That slow, creeping shadow reminding you that your time is coming too. And yet, you sleep eventually, not because you feel safe, but because you have to. Because morning always comes, whether you're ready or not. You made it. Another night survived. Another day of wind, blood, dust, and hard-earned silence finally behind you. The fire's gone cold now. Your bedroll is stiff. Your boots damp from last night's frost. But you're still here. And for a cowboy, that was always enough. The life you've just stepped through, it wasn't glamorous. It wasn't all saloons and six-shooters, painted sunsets, or righteous duels at high noon. It was slower, rougher, much lonelier. A cowboy's world was made of hard labor, frozen mornings, half-cooked beans, saddle sores, superstition, and silence. It was missing teeth and missing friends. It was riding till your legs went numb, praying your horse didn't stumble on loose shale, and sleeping with your revolver wrapped in your coat because a coyote's howl sounded just a little too close. It was eating something that tasted like ash and hoping it didn't kill you. It was listening to grown men cry in their sleep and pretending you didn't hear. It was knowing you could die of a cough, a fever, or a horse that stepped wrong in the river, and no one would even know your full name. It was 1,000 tiny discomforts and 100 unspoken fears piled into a single day, and then repeated again tomorrow, and tomorrow, and tomorrow. But somehow, they endured. They kept riding, kept waking up under a sky with no ceiling and a ground that didn't care if they stood or not. Not because they loved it, but because that was life. There were mouths to feed, fences to mend, cattle to move, and no one else to do it. So they saddled up, every morning, every season, every decade. They rode through blizzards, through drought, through war, through loss. And they left behind no statues, no speeches, just worn hats, broken boots, and memories whispered around firelight long after the last hoofprint had faded. And you? You're not there. Not anymore. You're warm, safe, lying in a real bed, maybe under a weighted blanket or a soft comforter that smells like detergent instead of smoke. You're surrounded by quiet, modern quiet. No wolves, no river crossings, no infected saddle sores or dust storms coming over the ridge. Your coffee, if you wanted one, wouldn't come with grounds in your teeth or soot in your cup. Your boots, if you wear them, aren't frozen stiff. And your ceiling doesn't disappear when the wind blows too hard. You have walls, hot water, lights you can turn on with a switch, a bathroom door, soap. So tonight, maybe, just for a moment, you let that sink in. Not in guilt, not in pity, just gratitude. Gratitude for comfort, for time, for silence without danger, for blankets that don't need to be packed into a saddlebag, for floors that don't bite your knees, for a world where you can choose to rest, not be forced to collapse. The cowboy didn't have that. He had the stars, the wind, a tin cup half full of lukewarm coffee, a coat that smelled like horses and failure, and a silence that stretched out across the prairie, wide as any grave. But you? You get to close your eyes knowing that no one's going to steal your horse while you sleep. You'll wake up tomorrow with clean water, warm air, and a world that doesn't try to kill you before breakfast. And that's no small thing. So go ahead now. Breathe slow. Feel the blanket over your chest. The stillness in the room. The quiet hum of whatever peace you've created for yourself. Let your hands relax. Let your shoulders drop. There's nothing left to do tonight. You don't have to keep watch. You don't have to check the herd. You don't have to stay close to the fire or worry if the wind shifts again. You're not a cowboy tonight. You're just you. And that's enough. So tonight, as you drift off, remember, you don't have to wake up in 1883. You don't have to saddle a horse in the dark. You don't have to ride with blistered hands or dig a grave for your best friend with a spoon. You get to sleep. And tomorrow, you get to wake up warm. So sleep well, partner. You've made it through the long ride, and the trail will still be there in the morning. But for now, just rest.